Welcome to Untold Black Legacies. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into history's untold stories that are hidden from the mainstream media. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. We will know the country and city you are watching from. Let us know in the comment section so we can connect better with you, and also tell us which historical event would you like us to uncover next.
In the suffocating summer of 1856, in the depths of rural Texas, there existed an event that slave owners simply called the race. It wasn't a competition. It was scheduled massacre, bloody entertainment for wealthy men bored with their lives of luxury built upon the suffering of others. Once a year, during 3 nights of the new moon, planters from across the South converged on Blackwater Plantation with their pockets full of gold and their souls empty of humanity. The rule was simple and brutal. 10 enslaved men were released into the swamp at 9 o'clock at night. At 9:15, the hunters set out after them. White men on horseback, armed with rifles and accompanied by packs of dogs trained to tear human flesh. The betting began weeks in advance. How long would the fastest one survive? How many bodies would be recovered by morning? Which master had the most resilient slave? No one had ever survived the Blackwater race. In 7 years of existence, 70 black men had been thrown into that swampy hell. 70 men had died, shot, drowned, torn apart by dogs, or simply swallowed by the mud and the night. Their bodies fed the alligators. Their names were forgotten before dawn. And the next morning, while house slaves cleaned the blood from the master's boots, life on the plantations continued as if nothing had happened. But in the 8th year, something changed. Among the 10 men chained in the yard of Blackwater Plantation that June night, there was one the other slaves called simply Abel. His back carried the scars of 200 lashes. His eyes had witnessed the sale of his wife and children to distant plantations. His hands knew only work and pain. But his mind had been busy for months, plotting something no slave owner could imagine. While the white men drank imported whiskey and counted stacks of gold coins by lantern light, while they adjusted their weapons and fed their dogs raw meat to awaken their hunger, Abel looked at the other 9 men beside him. And they all looked back, because they all knew this night would be different. This night, the hunters would become the hunted. Before we continue with this shocking story, tell me, which city are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Let's continue. The Blackwater Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of East Texas wilderness, where pine forests gave way to cypress swamps and the land itself seemed to hold secrets in its dark waters. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the property from his father, along with 147 human beings he considered livestock. But the colonel had grown tired of cotton and tobacco. He craved something more stimulating than profit margins and harvest reports. That's when he conceived the race. The first year in 1849, it had been almost accidental. A drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters about whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp. By the 2nd year, word had spread across the South. Wealthy men arrived from as far as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their finest horses, their deadliest weapons, and their most disposable property. The event became legend in the shadowy world of the plantation elite. Whispered about in gentlemen's clubs, discussed over cigars and brandy, but never mentioned in polite society or in the presence of northern abolitionists. The swamp itself was perfect for the purpose. 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, it was a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, quicksand pits, and predators both reptilian and insect. A man could disappear there and never be found. Many had. But while Colonel Whitmore thought he controlled every aspect of his twisted game, he had made one critical miscalculation. He believed the men he sent into that swamp were broken, defeated, too terrified and exhausted to think beyond their own survival. He never imagined they could plan. He never considered they might communicate. He never dreamed they could organize. And he certainly never suspected that his own house slaves, the ones he trusted to serve his meals and shine his boots, were part of the conspiracy. 3 months before the 8th annual race, Abel had been sold to Blackwater Plantation for $800. He arrived in chains, his body emaciated from weeks on the auction circuit, his spirit supposedly crushed by the loss of his family. Colonel Whitmore considered it a bargain, a prime field hand at nearly half the going rate of $1,500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Abel's reputation as a troublemaker had lowered his value significantly. He had attempted escape twice before at his previous plantation in Louisiana. He had been caught both times and punished with 100 lashes each time, the scars crisscrossing his back like a brutal map of resistance and defiance. What the colonel didn't know was that Abel had learned something during those failed escape attempts. He had learned patience. He had learned to watch, to listen, to gather information while appearing defeated and broken. And most importantly, he had learned that freedom achieved alone was no freedom at all. Not when it meant leaving brothers and sisters behind in bondage, not when it meant your own liberation was built on the continued suffering of others who had helped you, sheltered you, kept your secrets. On his 3rd day at Blackwater, while working in the cotton fields under the brutal June sun that turned the air thick as honey, Abel heard 2 overseers discussing the race. They spoke casually, laughing about the previous year's event, about how the betting pool had reached $20,000 in gold coin and banknotes, about how one man had made it almost a mile before the dogs caught him and tore open his legs, about how another had tried to hide underwater in a cypress hollow and drowned when he stayed under too long. The overseers found it all tremendously amusing, slapping their thighs and wiping tears of laughter from their eyes. They mentioned that Colonel Whitmore himself had won $4,000 on a bet that no slave would survive past midnight, proving once again that the colonel knew his property better than anyone. Abel said nothing. He kept his head down, his hands moving steadily through the cotton bolls, filling his sack with the white fiber that built Southern fortunes. But his mind was racing, calculating, remembering every word. That evening in the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins behind the main house where the enslaved population lived in conditions barely fit for animals, Abel sat quietly, while the other men and women ate their meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork. The portions were carefully measured to provide just enough nutrition to keep them working, but never enough to satisfy the constant gnawing hunger. He listened to their conversations, learning names, relationships, hierarchies, the invisible social structure that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. There was Samuel, a massive man who worked as the plantation blacksmith, worth at least $2,000 because of his specialized skills in metalworking and repair. There was Moses, quick and clever, who tended the colonel's horses, including a thoroughbred stallion valued at $3,000 that had been shipped from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, who had been at Blackwater longer than anyone else, 15 years of unbroken servitude that had left him gaunt but observant. His value diminished to perhaps $500 due to age and visible exhaustion. There was Caleb, young and strong at 22 years old, purchased just months earlier from a plantation in Alabama for $1,200, his youth and strength making him valuable for the hardest field work. There was Ruth, one of the house slaves who cleaned the colonel's study and overheard conversations the white men thought were private. Her value set at $1,000 despite her ability to read and write. Skills she kept carefully hidden because literacy in a slave was considered dangerous. Abel watched them all carefully. He said little during those first weeks, establishing himself as quiet and compliant, never drawing attention to himself. He worked hard, never complained, never met the eyes of white men directly, performed every task with mechanical efficiency. The overseers began to relax around him, convinced that the whippings at his previous plantation had finally broken whatever defiant spirit he once possessed. They stopped watching him as closely, stopped checking on him as frequently, and that was exactly what Abel wanted. Invisibility was a kind of freedom, the freedom to observe without being observed, to plan without being suspected. It was Ruth who approached him first. She came to his cabin on a moonless night, 2 weeks after his arrival, moving silently through the darkness like a ghost. Abel had been lying on his rough straw mattress, staring at the ceiling through gaps in the wooden planks, when her shadow appeared in his doorway. The cabin was barely 10 feet square, with walls that didn't quite meet the roof and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. 6 men slept there, packed together. But that night, Abel was alone because the others were working a night shift in the sugar house. "You planning something?" she whispered. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. Abel remained still, unsure if this was a trap. House slaves sometimes reported to the master in exchange for small privileges, an extra piece of meat, a warmer blanket, a day without work. The masters called them good slaves and rewarded their betrayals, while the other enslaved people called them something else entirely. Ruth seemed to read his thoughts. "I ain't no informer. I've been here 6 years. I seen 3 races. I seen 30 men go into that swamp. 30 men who never came back. One of them was my brother. His name was Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs got him in the first hour. I heard him screaming from the main house where I was serving brandy to the men who bet on how long he'd last." Abel sat up slowly. In the faint starlight coming through the gaps in the cabin walls, he could see her face clearly now, the hatred burning in her eyes like hot coals. The same hatred he carried in his own chest like a permanent weight. "I heard the overseers talking about you," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "Said you tried to run twice before at the Marchant Plantation in Louisiana. Said you took 100 lashes each time and didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't break. Said you're either the bravest fool they ever seen or the most dangerous. I think you're dangerous, and I think you're planning something for the race." Abel studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk. Then he nodded once, slowly, committing himself to trust, because without trust there could be no plan, no resistance, no chance. "The colonel keeps his guns in a cabinet in his study," Ruth said quickly, as if she'd been waiting months to share this information. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all loaded and ready. The key hangs on a hook behind his desk, right next to the portrait of his father. Every night after dinner, he drinks a bottle of bourbon, sometimes 2 if he's had a good day. By 10 o'clock he can barely walk straight. The overseers play cards in the barn until midnight, drinking corn whiskey and betting pocket money. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but only one handler sleeps nearby in a small room attached to the kennel, and he's deaf in his left ear from a hunting accident 5 years ago. Abel felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous, treacherous hope that could get you killed if you believed in it too much. But also the only thing that made survival worthwhile. "How many others know?" he asked quietly. "Samuel knows. Moses knows. Isaiah been talking about it for years. But he never had nobody willing to lead, nobody crazy enough to try. There's others too. People who work in the house. People who move around the property. Maybe 10, 12 people total who would help if they thought there was a real chance. We've been waiting for someone like you." Over the following weeks, Abel moved carefully through the plantation, making contact with each person Ruth had mentioned. They met in small groups, never more than 3 at a time, always in different locations to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. In the blacksmith shop, where the ring of hammer on anvil covered their whispered conversations. In the tobacco drying barn, where the thick leaves absorbed sound and created shadowy spaces. In the cistern behind the kitchen, where the splash of water being drawn masked their voices. Each meeting was brief, purposeful, focused on gathering information and building trust. Samuel the blacksmith became essential to their plan. He was a thoughtful man despite his size, someone who had spent years working with metal and fire, understanding how things could be shaped and transformed. He began setting aside pieces of scrap iron, shaping them secretly into crude but effective weapons. A blade attached to a wooden handle that could pierce flesh, a spike that could be driven through bone, lengths of chain that could strangle or be used to bind. He worked slowly, carefully, never taking so much material that it would be noticed, never working on the weapons when anyone was watching. Over 8 weeks he accumulated enough weapons for 10 men, hiding them in 3 separate locations around the property, buried in oilcloth to prevent rust, placed where they could be retrieved quickly when needed. Moses studied the horses and the layout of the property with an expert eye. He had been working with animals since childhood and understood their behavior, their fears, their instincts. He reported that the colonel owned 8 horses, all kept in the main stable near the house. The thoroughbred stallion was worth more than any 3 slaves combined, and the colonel guarded it jealously, checking on it personally every evening. But the other horses were often left unsupervised after dark, their stable doors closed but not locked. The assumption being that no slave would dare try to steal a horse because the punishment was death by hanging. Moses also mapped the swamp entrances, identifying which paths led to quicksand and which were relatively safe. Information gathered over years of retrieving game birds the white men had shot during hunting expeditions. He knew where the water was shallow enough to wade through, and where it dropped suddenly to depths of 8 or 10 feet. He knew which cypress trees had roots you could stand on, and which concealed sinkholes that would swallow a man whole. Isaiah, despite his age and exhaustion, despite the way his hands shook from years of brutal labor, proved to have the sharpest memory of anyone Abel had ever met. He recounted every detail of the previous 7 races, describing the exact timing, the positions of the hunters, the routes the fleeing men had taken. He remembered that the hunters always split into 3 groups, one circling left around the swamp's perimeter, one circling right, one driving straight through the middle in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side of the swamp, where the ground was firmest and allowed them to build up speed. He remembered that the colonel himself never entered the swamp. Instead, watching from a raised platform near the starting point, a wooden structure about 8 feet high that gave him a clear view of the initial chase. From that platform, he collected bets from latecomers and distributed winnings to those who had guessed correctly about survival times and death methods. Last year's race had drawn 17 plantation owners with a betting pool of $23,000 in gold and banknotes, the largest sum yet assembled for the event. Ruth continued to serve in the main house, listening to every conversation, reading every letter left carelessly on the colonel's desk, observing the rhythms and routines of the white family and their guests. She learned that this year's race was scheduled for June 15th, 16th and 17th, during the new moon when darkness would be complete and the hunting would be most challenging. She learned that invitations had been sent to planters across 5 states, each one hand-delivered by trusted servants. She learned that the colonel had bragged to his peers about acquiring fresh stock, including a troublemaker from Louisiana who was sure to provide exciting sport, a clear reference to Abel himself. She learned that the entry fee for hunters had been raised to $500 per night, with all proceeds going into the prize pool, making this year's event potentially the most lucrative yet. The colonel expected this year's race to be the largest yet, perhaps drawing 30 participants and a betting pool exceeding $40,000. But most importantly, Ruth learned something the colonel had mentioned casually over dinner one evening, something he considered insignificant, but which changed everything about Abel's planning. This year, for the first time, the colonel planned to allow the selected slaves to spend the afternoon before the race unchained, to let them build up hope before crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological torture would make the event more entertaining, that men who spent hours contemplating possible escape routes would run harder, fight more desperately, provide better sport for the paying audience. The idea had come from one of his guests the previous year, a plantation owner from Mississippi who claimed to have extensive experience in managing slave psychology for optimal performance. When Ruth reported this to Abel, he smiled for the first time since arriving at Blackwater. It was not a pleasant smile, not the smile of happiness or joy, but the smile of a man who had just been handed the key to his enemy's destruction. "That's when we move," he said quietly. The plan took shape slowly over the following weeks, refined through dozens of whispered conversations, tested against every possible contingency they could imagine. They would not try to escape during the race itself, which is what everyone expected, what every slave before them had attempted. They would not run blindly into the swamp, where terrain and trained hunters gave all advantage to the white men. Instead, they would turn the event inside out, transform the hunters into the hunted, use the chaos and darkness to their advantage, and strike back with a violence that would echo across the South for generations. But they needed more than weapons and timing. They needed people willing to die if necessary, willing to fight against impossible odds, willing to sacrifice individual survival for collective revenge. They needed men who had reached the point where death held no terror because life had become indistinguishable from death, where the only remaining choice was between dying like an animal or dying like a warrior. Abel approached each candidate personally, usually late at night, always in private. Caleb was first. The young man from Alabama had been selected for the race, chosen because of his youth and strength, qualities the colonel believed would make for exciting sport, a man who would run fast and far before being brought down. When Abel told him the plan in complete detail, holding nothing back, Caleb's eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked almost like hunger. "You talking about killing white men?" Caleb whispered, the words barely forming on his lips. "They'll hunt us forever. They'll kill everyone on this plantation. They'll make an example that'll be remembered for 100 years. They're going to kill us anyway," Abel replied calmly, stating it as simple fact. "You've been selected for the race. You understand what that means? You got maybe one chance in 100 of seeing sunrise, and that's if you lucky. Most men don't last 2 hours. The record is 3 hours and 40 minutes, set 3 years ago by a man named Joshua, who made it almost to the western edge before the dogs cornered him against a ravine. They say he fought the dogs with his bare hands for 15 minutes before a hunter shot him in the head. That's the best anyone has ever done. 3 hours and 40 minutes of terror before dying. Is that the death you want?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. Then he nodded slowly. "I rather die fighting than die running. I rather take some of them with me than just be their sport." Abel found similar resolve in the others. There was Thomas, a field hand who had watched his wife sold away 3 years earlier. Her price of $900 used to pay the colonel's gambling debts after a bad night of cards in New Orleans. Thomas had tried to buy her freedom, had begged the colonel to sell him instead, had offered to work double shifts for the rest of his life. The colonel had laughed in his face and sold the woman to a brothel in Mobile. There was Benjamin, who bore scars on his arms from a punishment that had involved holding hot coals for speaking back to an overseer, a torture that had left his hands permanently damaged, reducing his value but not his hatred. There was Elijah, whose son had been beaten to death at age 12 for stealing an apple from the colonel's orchard. His small body valued at nothing in the plantation ledgers, his murder recorded simply as disposed of damaged property, with no further explanation or consequence. There was Marcus, who had been separated from his mother at age 8 and sold at auction in Charleston for $400, who could still remember her screaming his name as he was loaded onto a wagon. There was Joseph, purchased just a year ago for $1,000 after his previous owner went bankrupt, who had been a house slave at a relatively comfortable plantation before being sold to the brutal conditions of Blackwater. Each man had a story written in scars and loss, Each man had reached the point where death held no more terror than life. Each man was ready. By late May, they had 10 men committed to the plan. They had weapons hidden in 3 separate locations around the property. They had detailed knowledge of the swamp, the timing of patrols, the habits of the overseers. They had Ruth and 3 other house slaves ready to help from inside the main house, to drug food if needed, to unlock doors, to create distractions. They had Moses ready to handle the horses, to scatter them at the critical moment. They had Samuel ready to break the locks on the ammunition storage if the opportunity presented itself. What they didn't have was any guarantee the plan would work. There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. A single betrayal would doom them all to torture and execution. A single mistake, one moment of hesitation or panic, could unravel everything. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was razor thin. Abel lay awake at night, reviewing every detail, searching for weaknesses, playing out scenarios in his mind. The weight of responsibility pressed on him like a physical thing, like carrying another person on his back. These men were trusting him with their lives. Their families, the other slaves on the plantation, everyone was at risk. If he failed, if the plan collapsed, the repercussions would be measured in blood and screaming. The colonel would make examples that would be talked about for decades, public torture and execution designed to crush any thought of resistance anywhere in the South. But if he succeeded, if they actually pulled this off, they would strike a blow that would echo far beyond Blackwater Plantation. They would prove that enslaved people could fight back, could organize, could defeat their oppressors despite overwhelming odds. They would create a story that would spread from plantation to plantation, whispered in fields and cabins, sung in coded spirituals, carrying a message of resistance and hope to thousands of people who lived without either. On June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his official selections for the race. He gathered all the male slaves in the main yard, walking among them like a man choosing livestock at market, examining muscles and teeth, asking questions about stamina and speed. He selected 10 men, calling out their names one by one with casual authority. Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 others who were not part of the conspiracy, who knew nothing about the plan: Simon, David, and Jacob. Abel's heart sank like a stone in water. 3 men who knew nothing. 3 men who would panic when the plan unfolded. 3 men who could ruin everything through ignorance or fear or simple bad luck. That evening he approached them separately, taking an enormous risk. Simon was 35, a quiet man who had been at Blackwater for 8 years, who kept to himself and rarely spoke. David was 42, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident in the lumber mill where a saw had caught his hand, an injury that had reduced his value by $300. Jacob was barely 19, newly purchased for $1,100 from a plantation in Mississippi, still raw from being torn away from his mother just weeks earlier. Abel told them everything. He laid out the entire plan, the weapons, the timing, the coordinated attack, the risks. He explained that they had 2 choices: join the conspiracy and have a chance at freedom and revenge, or run blindly into the swamp and die like the 70 men before them, their deaths entertainment for wealthy men who would forget their names before breakfast. Simon listened carefully, his face revealing nothing. Then he asked a single question in a voice steady as iron. "You really think we can kill them all?" "No," Abel answered honestly, because lies would help no one now. "I think some of us will die. Maybe most of us. Maybe all of us. But I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running like an animal while they place bets on how long I last." Simon thought for a moment, weighing possibilities. Then he extended his hand. "I'm in. Been waiting 8 years for a chance like this." David was harder to convince. He was older, more cautious, worn down by years of brutality that had taught him the futility of resistance. "Even if we kill everyone here," he said slowly, They'll send the army. They'll send bounty hunters. They'll track us to Mexico if they have to. They'll make it a national cause, proof that slaves can't be trusted, justification for even worse treatment everywhere. Maybe, Abel agreed. Probably. But at least we'll die as men, not as property. At least we'll make them pay a price. At least somewhere, some other slaves will hear about what we did and know it's possible. David stared at his mutilated hand, the two missing fingers a permanent reminder of how little white men cared about black bodies, how easily they discarded and damaged human beings in pursuit of profit. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'm in. Got nothing left to lose anyway. Jacob was the biggest risk. He was young, scared, still harboring illusions that compliance might earn mercy, that being a good slave might result in decent treatment. But he was also angry, still raw from being torn from his mother and sold like cattle. Abel gambled on that anger, on the freshness of his wounds. They paid $1,100 for you. Abel told him quietly. You know what that means. You're expensive property, valuable, prime stock. But the moment you step into that swamp, you stop being valuable. You become entertainment. They're going to shoot you for fun, like you're a deer or a rabbit. Your mother sold you thinking at least you'd live, at least you'd survive, even if she never saw you again. You want to prove her wrong. You want to die for their amusement 3 weeks after she said goodbye? Tears rolled down Jacob's face, but his jaw was set. What do I have to do? Now they were 13. 10 who had planned for months, and 3 who had been forced to adapt instantly. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to be enough. The final 2 weeks passed in agonizing slowness, each day stretching out endlessly. The plantation buzzed with preparation for the race. Carriages began arriving daily, bringing wealthy men from across the South. They came with servants, with hunting dogs on leashes, with expensive rifles in leather cases. They filled the guest quarters in the main house and overflowed into tents erected on the lawn, creating a temporary village of wealth and privilege. The smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke hung over the property constantly. At night, lantern light spilled from the main house windows as the guests drank and gambled and told stories about previous hunts, about slaves they had killed, about the entertainment value of human suffering. Ruth reported the names she overheard while serving drinks. Richard Beaumont from New Orleans, a sugar plantation owner worth over $200,000 who owned 3 plantations and over 400 slaves. Henry Caldwell from Alabama, who owned 4 plantations and nearly 600 slaves, who had built his fortune on cotton and cruelty in equal measure. William Preston from Georgia, who had won $3,000 at last year's race by correctly betting that 1 slave would survive past midnight but not see dawn. Thomas Ashford from Mississippi, who had brought 12 dogs and was offering side bets of $100 per dog on which animal would draw first blood. Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, who owned a slave trading company and had personally auctioned over 15,000 human beings in his career, separating families and selling children with the casual efficiency of a man selling livestock. These were not poor men struggling to survive. These were not desperate men driven by need. These were the wealthiest, most powerful members of Southern society, men who shaped laws and controlled governments, men who sat in state legislatures and congressional seats, men who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization while organizing hunts of human beings for entertainment. They saw no contradiction in attending church on Sunday and betting on how long a man could survive being hunted on Saturday. The betting pool grew larger than any previous year. By June 14th, it had reached $52,000 in gold coins, banknotes, and promissory notes from banks across the South. The colonel displayed it in leather bags on a special table in the main house, arranged like trophies for all the guests to admire. $52,000, more money than any slave would see in 10 lifetimes of labor, more money than most white men would earn in 20 years of work. All of it wagered on human suffering. The slaves working in the main house reported that the guests were particularly excited this year. They spoke of fresh blood and new sport. They discussed strategy for the hunt, debated the best positions, compared weapons. They fed the dogs raw meat and let them go hungry for 2 days before the race, to sharpen their hunger and aggression, to make them more vicious when released. On the morning of June 15th, the selected 13 were separated from the other slaves and taken to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. As promised, they were kept unchained, though 4 armed overseers watched them constantly from a raised platform. They were given extra food, cornbread and actual meat, a mockery of kindness designed to give them energy for running. The white men wanted good sport. They didn't want their prey to collapse from exhaustion before the entertainment began. Abel used the time to review the plan one final time with the others, speaking in voices too low for the overseers to hear. They huddled in a corner of the pen, their bodies blocking the view, their words carried away by the afternoon breeze. Samuel would be positioned near the eastern edge, where he had hidden 3 iron blades wrapped in oilcloth. Moses would head for the western side, near where the horses were tied to a rail fence. Thomas and Benjamin would stay together in the center, where crude spears fashioned from sharpened wood were buried under leaves and mud. The others would spread out in a loose formation, each man knowing his role, each man ready to adapt if things went wrong, which they almost certainly would. The critical moment would come 30 minutes after they were released, when the hunters entered the swamp with confidence high and guard down. The slaves would not be running away in panic. They would be circling back, using paths they had studied for months, positioning themselves for ambush, turning from prey into predators. "They think we're animals," Abel told the others quietly. "They think we're going to run in panic, make mistakes, die easy. That's what they've seen for 7 years. That's what they expect. So we give them the opposite. We move slow and careful. We move quiet. We use everything we know about this swamp, and they know nothing. And when they come into our territory, when they're spread out and overconfident, we take them apart one by one." As darkness fell across Blackwater Plantation, the guests assembled near the starting point. Dozens of lanterns illuminated the scene, casting long, dancing shadows across the lawn. The dogs strained at their leashes, snarling and snapping at the air. The hunters checked their weapons with practiced efficiency, loading rifles and pistols, adjusting sights, preparing for the hunt. The colonel stood on his raised platform, addressing the crowd with whiskey-soaked pride, his voice booming across the assembled wealth. "Gentlemen," he called out, spreading his arms wide, "welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. This year, we have 13 fine specimens for your entertainment. The betting pool stands at $52,000, the largest in our history. As always, bets may be placed on survival time, distance traveled, or manner of death. The prey will be released at 9 o'clock sharp. The hunt begins at 9:15. May the best hunter win, and may we all enjoy a profitable evening." The crowd cheered enthusiastically. Money changed hands as last-minute wagers were made. Someone bet $500 that no slave would make it past the first creek. Someone else bet $300 that the dogs would kill at least 3 men before the hunters fired a shot. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, like a county fair or holiday gathering. The 13 men were led to the starting line by overseers with whips and rifles. Abel looked back at the assembled white men, at their confident faces, at their expensive clothing, at the weapons glinting in the lantern light. He memorized every detail. These were the faces of people who considered themselves superior, who believed they had a God-given right to own and destroy human beings, who built their entire civilization on the principle that some lives had value and others did not. In a few hours, Abel thought, some of those faces would be gone forever. The colonel raised a pistol high above his head. The crowd fell silent, anticipation thick in the air. Then he fired into the sky, the shot echoing across the property. The race had begun. The 13 men sprinted into the darkness, their feet splashing through shallow water at the swamp's edge. Behind them, the crowd roared with excitement. Someone shouted encouragement to their favorite hunter. The dogs howled desperately, straining to be released, but for exactly 15 minutes the slaves would have a head start. Time to establish distance, time to disappear into the labyrinth of water and trees. Abel led the group deeper into the swamp, but not at full speed. Running all out would exhaust them within minutes and leave them gasping for breath when they needed to be silent. They needed to preserve energy and stay together. In previous years, the slaves had scattered in panic, each man trying to save himself, that individualism dooming them all to isolation and death. 200 yards, then we split. Abel called back to the others, his voice low but clear. Remember the markers. Remember the plan. They had spent weeks learning this terrain, mapping every feature in their minds. That lightning-struck cypress meant turn left towards solid ground. That cluster of rocks meant safety for 50 feet. That patch of glowing moss meant quicksand that could swallow a man in minutes. Knowledge was their only real advantage against horses and guns and trained dogs. At exactly 9:15, they heard the second gunshot. The hunters were coming. They heard dogs baying, men shouting to each other, the splash of horses entering the water. Now, Abel hissed. The group split into 4 units as planned. Abel took Simon, Jacob, and Caleb with him, circling toward the eastern edge where Samuel had hidden weapons. Thomas and Benjamin moved west with David, heading for the wooden spears. Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah headed north toward the deepest part of the swamp, where horses couldn't follow, where the water was over a man's head, and cypress roots created a maze no one could navigate without intimate knowledge. Each group knew their route, their destination, their timing. The plan was for everyone to circle back toward the starting point from different directions, creating confusion, making the hunters think they were chasing fleeing prey, when in reality, they were walking into carefully prepared killing zones. Abel's group moved quickly through water that came up to their thighs, cold and black and smelling of decay. They could hear the hunters behind them, shouting coordinates to each other, the dogs baying with bloodlust. But the sounds were moving in the wrong direction. The hunters were following the obvious trail, the one that led deeper into the swamp in a straight line. They think we're running straight like everyone before us, Caleb whispered, following instinct instead of strategy. Good, Abel replied quietly. Let them think we're animals. They reached the lightning-struck cypress and found Samuel's cache exactly where it was supposed to be. 3 pieces of iron filed into crude blades, each about 8 inches long, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. Abel took one, feeling the weight in his hand, the rough metal grip Samuel had fashioned. He gave the others to Caleb and Jacob. Simon picked up a heavy branch, thick as a man's arm, that would serve as an effective club. Remember what we planned, Abel said quietly, all of them crouching in the shadows, with water lapping at their chests. We don't attack unless we're sure we can win. We pick off stragglers and isolated hunters. We avoid groups. We use the darkness and their own confusion against them. They crouched low in the water, only their heads above the surface, and waited with the patience of men who had spent their entire lives waiting, who understood that patience was sometimes the only power the powerless possessed. The first hunter appeared 23 minutes later, moving alone through the darkness. He was young, maybe 25, wearing expensive riding clothes now soaked and muddy. He carried a rifle that probably cost more than Abel's sale price, a beautiful weapon with silver inlay and a polished stock. He moved carelessly, thrashing through the water, making noise, convinced of his own safety, certain that the prey were ahead of him, fleeing in terror, and not behind him, waiting in ambush. He never saw Abel rise from the water like a ghost made flesh. The iron blade went into his back between the ribs and angled upward toward the heart. The man tried to scream, but Abel's other hand covered his mouth, muffling the sound. They pulled him underwater, holding him down as he struggled, as his movements became weaker, as the life left his body, and he became just another piece of the swamp. His expensive rifle sank into the mud, lost forever. "One," Abel whispered, feeling not joy but grim satisfaction. This was justice, crude and brutal, but justice nonetheless. They moved on carefully, following the edge of the swamp back toward the starting point. They heard gunshots in the distance, then shouting that sounded confused, almost panicked. The hunters had discovered something, probably one of the decoy trails the slaves had prepared. More confusion, more chaos. Perfect. The second hunter they found was older, experienced, moving more carefully than the first. He had a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other, a tactical error that destroyed his night vision while advertising his position to anyone watching. Abel let him pass, staying low in the water. Then Simon rose behind him silently and brought the heavy branch down on the back of his skull with devastating force. The man dropped instantly. They took his pistol and lantern, valuable prizes. 2. Caleb counted quietly. From different parts of the swamp came sounds of violence. A dog yelping, the sound cut short by something brutal. Men shouting in alarm, their voices high with fear. A gunshot, then another, then silence. The other groups were engaging the hunters, picking them off, disrupting the hunt. Abel's group reached the western edge of the swamp and found Moses waiting with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 dead hunters and 2 dead dogs, their bodies partially submerged in dark water. Moses held a pistol he'd taken from one of the bodies. "The horses?" Abel asked quietly. "Scattered them like we planned," Moses replied with grim satisfaction. "Cut through the tethers, fired a shot in the air. They panicked and ran in all directions. Some of the white men went chasing after them, on foot, away from the swamp. Pure chaos. This was better than Abel had dared to hope. More chaos, more confusion, more hunters separated and vulnerable. "How many total have we killed?" Thomas asked. "At least 7, maybe more," Moses said. "But they're starting to realize something's wrong. I heard them trying to regroup near the center, calling for each other. Then we hit them while they're grouped," Abel decided. "All of us together. One fast attack, then we scatter before they can organize a real defense." They moved through the darkness toward the sounds of men calling to each other, voices filled with confusion and rising fear. The hunters had indeed gathered in a clearing, perhaps 15 of them, lanterns raised high, guns pointed at shadows. They were afraid now, the realization dawning that something had gone terribly wrong with their entertainment. The predators had become prey, and they knew it in their bones. Abel's group circled around them quietly, joined by Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah, emerging from the north like vengeful spirits. 13 slaves, armed with stolen guns, crude blades, clubs, and stones. 13 men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. They attacked from 4 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault born of desperation and rage and months of planning. The gunfire was deafening, echoing across the swamp. Men screamed. Lanterns shattered, plunging sections of the clearing into darkness. In the chaos and confusion, hunters shot at each other as often as at the slaves. Abel saw the young man from South Carolina, Jonathan Reed, the slave trader, who had sold 15,000 human beings, trying to reload his rifle with trembling hands. Abel's blade opened his throat. 15,000 lives ended with one stroke. The fight lasted perhaps 4 minutes, an eternity compressed into moments of pure violence. When it was over, 12 more hunters lay dead or dying. The remaining few fled into the darkness, their courage evaporated, running in blind panic like the prey they had come to hunt. Abel took stock quickly. They had lost Benjamin, shot through the chest in the initial exchange of gunfire. They had lost David, his skull crushed by a rifle butt. 11 men remained standing, 11 survivors out of 13. Back to the plantation, Abel ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Before they can regroup and organize a real defense. They moved quickly through the swamp, following paths they knew by heart, every root and stone familiar. Behind them, they could hear scattered gunfire, men shooting at shadows, fear consuming what remained of the hunting party. When they emerged from the swamp covered in mud and blood, they found the plantation in complete disarray. The guests who hadn't entered the swamp were gathering their belongings in panic, preparing to flee. Servants ran frantically. Dogs barked. The horses that hadn't been scattered were being hastily saddled by trembling hands. The colonel stood on his raised platform, trying to organize a defense, his face purple with rage and alcohol and dawning terror. "What are you doing?" he screamed at his guests, his voice breaking. "They're slaves, just slaves. We have guns, we have numbers, we can—" He never finished the sentence. Moses shot him from 30 feet away with steady hands. The colonel fell backward off the platform, landing in the dirt with his skull shattered, his blood soaking into the ground he had walked on like a king. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution, brutal and swift and merciless. The slaves had surprise, desperation, intimate knowledge of the property, and the support of over 100 other enslaved people who now saw their chance for freedom. The white men had panic, confusion, greed that made them prioritize saving their valuables over defending themselves, and the fatal arrogance of people who had never truly believed the enslaved could fight back. Some tried to fight, some tried to run, some tried to hide in buildings and root cellars. None succeeded. Ruth and the other house slaves joined in, using knives from the kitchen, heavy candlesticks, iron pokers from the fireplace, whatever they could find. Samuel opened the weapons cabinet in the colonel's study, distributing rifles to anyone who could shoot. The plantation slaves, previously uninvolved in the conspiracy, saw their opportunity and rose up. 147 people, enslaved and brutalized for years, turned on their oppressors with a fury that had been building across generations. By midnight, it was finished. 34 white men lay dead. The guests from Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, all the wealthy plantation owners who had come for entertainment, the colonel and his overseers, the handlers and supervisors, all of them ended. The main house was burning, flames climbing into the night sky like a beacon, consuming the grand architecture built with slave labor. The stables were burning, the cotton storehouse was burning. Smoke and fire turned the darkness into hellish daylight, visible for miles. In the colonel's study, before the flames consumed it, they found the leather bags containing $52,000. Abel stared at the money for a long moment, all that gold and paper representing bets on human suffering. Then he picked up one bag and hurled it into the growing fire. "We're not thieves," he said firmly. "We're not property anymore. We're free people, and free people don't take blood money." The others followed his example without hesitation. $52,000, the price of blood sport and human degradation, burning to ash and smoke. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the survivors gathered in the yard. Of the original 13 selected for the race, 11 remained alive. Of the other plantation slaves, all but a handful had survived the uprising. 143 people, no longer property, no longer slaves, standing together as the sun rose on a new day. They took what supplies they could carry. Weapons, food, blankets, tools, anything useful for the journey ahead. They freed all the remaining animals, except the horses, which they would ride in shifts. Then they left in small groups, moving in different directions initially to confuse pursuit, all ultimately heading toward Mexico and freedom, leaving behind nothing but smoke and ruins and a story that would spread across the South like wildfire. The Blackwater race never happened again. The property was eventually seized by the state and auctioned off, but no one wanted it. The legend of what happened there, of slaves rising up and slaughtering their masters, made it cursed ground. Local people claimed to hear screams coming from the swamp on moonless nights. The building sat empty for years until it finally collapsed from neglect. And in the slave quarters across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond, people spoke in whispers about Abel and the night the hunters became the hunted, about the race that ended with fire and blood and freedom. The story grew with each telling, becoming both symbol and inspiration. A reminder that oppression could be resisted, that the oppressed could fight back, that even the most powerful could fall. Abel and his companions reached Mexico 7 weeks later after fighting through pursuit by bounty hunters and militia. Most survived to build new lives south of the border. Some returned years later after the Civil War to search for families torn apart by slavery. Some disappeared into history, their fates unknown, their names forgotten but their actions remembered. But the story lived on, and every plantation owner who heard it felt a tremor of fear, wondering if their own slaves were planning something similar, wondering if they too might one day face the vengeance they had spent lifetimes earning. The Blackwater Massacre killed 34 white men and freed 143 black souls. The financial loss, including property, crops, and human assets, exceeded $300,000. But the psychological impact was incalculable, a crack in the foundation of slavery itself, proof that the system could be broken by those it sought to crush. And somewhere in Mexico, Abel built a quiet life, never forgetting the night he transformed from prey to predator, never forgetting the men and women who fought beside him, never forgetting that freedom is not given but taken, paid for in blood and fire and absolute refusal to accept bondage as fate.